Hello, I'm Xaq Frohlich and welcome to another Food and Power class. Today I'm going to talk about nutritionism and the obesity epidemic. The class is broken into three parts. In the first part, I'll ask the question, how do you know what you know about healthy diets? Then I'm going to give a mini history of nutrition, talking about the concept of nutritionism and also the epidemiological transition. And then in the third part, I will talk about the obesity epidemic and the idea that we are responsible for our health, and which has become an ideology known by some sociologists as healthism. Before I start, I wanted to ask you the question, how do you know what you know is good for you to eat? And I would like you to pause the video. Below on the comments, write down, what are your sources for that approach to diet? What are your sources that help change the way you think about what you eat? And I want you to think back to the last time you changed something in your diet and ask the question, why? Why did you do so? What caused you to make that change? And then you can start the video, and I look forward to reading your comments below. This question, how do you know what you know, interests me in part because as a scholar of science studies, science is constantly exploring and producing new knowledge about diet. And as you can see on this chart here, this pyramid, which is a humorous joke about levels of evidence in science, below scientists might write editorials or their expert opinions about what they think is the appropriate approach to take towards food and diet. Above that, you would have more systematic case series or case reports. Physicians might write about a particular case or patient they had and then publish that in a medical journal. And then you start to get into larger scale studies where they try to control for some particular dietary issue or dietary element. And the gold standard of scientific knowledge would be the randomized clinical trials, in particular double-blind, where both the experimenter and the person in the experiment doesn't know who has the treatment or the intervention. And then eventually, when many randomized clinical trials are done, you might do a systematic review, which would be published in a medical journal, talking about this is now what all of these trials find. But with diet science, this is problematic. And on the left side of this slide, you can see a survey from the Nurses' Health Study in the United States, where they were trying to determine what it is that people eat. And of course, the problem is people don't tend to remember exactly what they eat day to day. And so one of the problems in diet science is you can try to create an experiment, a very controlled experiment where you change one thing in a person's diet. But it's hard having people participate because diet is something that people have to think about every day, and if you're constantly asking them to be conscious of one particular element or doing one thing, they might forget one day or forget the next day, or even worse, get bored and then drop out of the study. The alternative, which they did in the Nurses' Health Study, is to do a survey where you ask people and you have what's called a natural experiment, and over time you try to see it by recalling each week what they ate. You try to find out if there are trends in their health outcomes. The problem here is that even if you ask a person what they ate yesterday, they might forget particular types of important sources of calories or vitamins. One thing I do with my students, and I have available online, a food diary where I ask students to keep track of everything they eat for 1 week. And what they discover is there are all kinds of sources of calories, like liquid calories, sauces, which people don't think about, but can be marginally important in a diet study like this. So this problem of the randomized clinical trial and how do you create a true source of knowledge about what is good or bad to eat following rigorous scientific standards is one of the reasons why there's so much disagreement and confusion between different scientific studies. And in 2002, the science journalist Gary Taubes published an article where he asked the question, what if it's all a big fat lie, in the New York Times Magazine? And what he meant was he was attacking the diet heart thesis, the idea that certain fatty acids, in particular from animal sources of fat, are correlated with heart disease and cholesterol. and this had become an established truth in the diet science in the 1990s. And in 2002, Gary Taubes says, what if this is in fact not the case? We haven't done rigorous clinical trials. We haven't done strong established scientific tests of this. And he argues instead that maybe the source of America's growing obesity epidemic is in fact simple sugars. So like many critics of one diet science, he replaces it with another theory, in this case, carbohydrates and simple sugars. I don't present Gary Taubes' article to say that in fact he is correct or that he is incorrect, but rather to give it as an example of how there is a lot of popular interest in this question of what is the best diet science. What should be the advice we follow on good or bad fats or good or bad foods? And as you can see from this slide, there are hundreds and hundreds of books published by experts of many different types who are arguing about why it is we're getting fatter, why it is we're having the kinds of heart diseases or different kinds of chronic degenerative diseases. But all of them face the same problem. What kind of science can help you answer this question? How do you do this with something that involves daily habits over long periods of time? How can you create a predictive science? And one of the questions I'm always asking my students when we think about diet science is what is in fact knowable? It is possible to do a randomized clinical trial testing a pill, where it's just one thing you take every day. But is it possible to do a similar kind of test about multiple things in one's diet and then come to a conclusion in a strong, rigorous way? Now, the interest in diets is motivated by many different elements. One group particularly interested in nutritional science and dietary advice are people who have special particular dietary problems, in particular patients. So for example, celiac patients might have an allergy to gluten, or other people might have an allergy to peanuts, and so they would be particularly concerned about those in their diet. Diabetics have to be careful about their intake of sugars. And if you're a pregnant woman, you might find lots of advice about what is the appropriate thing to eat, what are potential risks for your unborn baby. And so for this reason, people under strict medical management or biomedical treatment might take a particular interest in diet as one element of their treatment. Now, I actually never did diet myself until I started getting interested in sports. And athletes are another group that are very interested in dieting. You'll hear people say you should listen to your body, and in general, personally, my body may not send me clear signals about what I do or do not need to eat. But when I started to get interested in long-distance running, for example, certain foods the day before a race had dramatic negative consequences for my body. And other foods I noticed over time were helpful as part of a regimen and strategy towards improving my race times. And so athletes can be particularly focused on finding the right balance of dietary elements and then gaming it with things like carb loading, where you eat a lot of carbohydrates. Similarly, after my race, one of my traditions and interest is binge eating, where that night, after months of trying to be good with my diet, I'll enjoy, for example, what can be seen here, the Korean chimek, which is fried chicken and beer. So one motivation for taking interest in your diet is sports. But probably the most important motivation for a lot of people in the developed world concerned about having a healthy diet is looking good. And so one of the concerns among nutritionists and people who give diet advice is, if you're motivated by looking good, is this in fact healthy? What is the difference between trying to have a healthy diet versus trying to just lose weight and get thin? And obviously, this kind of motivation is a different sort of motivation than in my class where we talk about hunger, where the concern is meeting a minimum amount of diet to survive. Here, the motivation is a minimum amount of food and nutrition in order to not gain weight. And thus, in this motivation, these people, the concern is about willpower and self-determination. And when people talk about dieting, they often ignore the context for those decisions. So this comic strip, for example, draws attention to how for some people what is willpower, for other people is simply not a matter of choice. And in the discussions today, when I ask you about nutrition and how nutrition science is shaping the way you eat, one of the things I want you to think about is how does that also contribute to a broader information environment for how you think about food? And what are those sources of information that may shape the way you look at your own body and think, how can I change my diet for health, for vanity, and for other reasons? And there are many sources of information that are influencing us today. In this diagram, which is from a technology assessment report in the 1990s, you can see in the center the imagined consumer and numerous influences. On the left side, you have social, cultural factors, her lifestyle, the lifestyle of her family. These are traditional subjects of interest for sociologists and anthropologists trying to understand diet and changes in individual habits. But you can also see on the right side a theory of mass media. What is a theory of media that could help us understand how, at a mass communication level, people might be influenced to change their diet? Advertisers, the way that food is packaged and sold, and then also just simply the questions of price and availability. How do all of these things influence a consumer to think about what foods she or he should purchase? And what is motivating us in how we listen to our body? Obviously, this is a question different for men than for women. It can be a question that leads to concerns about vanity eating that can become potentially unhealthy, such as anorexia. And so when we think about people who say, just listen to your body, of course, this is a much more complicated story than cravings or listening to what your body physically says, because this can also become a mental challenge. What is our mind telling us about what our body is saying? Do we ignore those bodily cravings? Do we listen to them? And why?